It seems that the Supreme Court may have had enough of lower courts acting like they're in charge. Or really, I should be more to the point, acting like they're in charge of the executive branch. Tony Katz Today. Great to be with you. That's William Jacobson right there, Cornell law professor, the mind behind legalinsurrection.com. You had the story that the Supreme Court stays the district court order that the U.S. has to pay $2 billion to foreign aid contractors. This all goes back to President Trump getting elected. I mean, that's truly what it goes back to, sir. But it goes back to the idea of whether or not the Trump administration can stop payments. Congress can allocate money, but there's a question of whether or not the president, the executive branch, can stop the payments. He wants the freeze. These lower courts say you're not allowed to do that. And now the Supreme Court, Chief John Roberts stepping in and saying, whoa. Everybody just stop for a moment. Can you give me a basis of what's happening here?
Sure. Well, the Democrats planned, and the New York Times wrote about this in last November after the election. The Democrats planned a campaign of lawfare. They lined up 800 lawyers, according to the New York Times, at least 40 organizations. And their intent was the second Trump did anything, they would be in court. And that's what's happened. We have several dozen lawsuits challenging virtually everything that he does. One piece of what they're challenging is his ability to slow down payments, slow down the distribution of funding. And in this case, it relates specifically to USAID under the State Department. There are contractors who purportedly perform services and who are purportedly owed money by the government. And the government said, slow down here. We're not just sending it out. We're going to review it. We're going to make sure they actually did what they said. We're going to make sure there's no fraud here. And a district court judge in DC has ordered them to make the payments. District Court Judge Amir Ali, who was, I believe, the last Biden judge who got confirmation. I believe it might have even been in December. And the only reason he got confirmed was two Republican senators, Braun and Cruz, decided not to show up for the vote. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been confirmed. Well-known left-wing activist, strongly opposed by Republicans. So he issues an order telling the government that by midnight last night, they had to pay $2 billion on these contracts. And the government says, well, wait a second here. First of all, you have no jurisdiction here. If these people have a claim to be paid, they have to go to the Court of Claims. They can't go to federal court. You have no basis for issuing this order. We have sovereign immunity, all these things. And he says, I don't care. He says, you're paying by midnight the next night, which was last night. They went to the DC Court of Appeals and said, wait a second, this is an unlawful TRO, temporary restraining order. He has no power to do this. It impinges on the executive branch. It's a violation of separation of powers. And the Court of Appeals told them to pound sand, said, this is improper. You should have appealed the prior TRO, not the enforcement of the TRO. Having, of course, told the government in another case a week ago, you can't appeal a TRO. Now they're saying you should have appealed the TRO. And so they went to the U.S. Supreme Court, raising a whole host of constitutional and jurisdictional issues. And just before midnight, I think about 10 p.m., Chief Justice Roberts, who has the responsibility for the D.C. Circuit, issued an order staying the district court.
Now, let's get into that, because each one of the Supreme Court justices does indeed have a part of the country that they oversee, other courts that they oversee. But let's go over what it is that got written here. This is from your site, from legalinsurrection.com. Government to the Supreme Court. The government cannot function, and the president cannot discharge his Article 2 responsibilities over foreign affairs if a district court can appoint itself claims processor for the federal government and second guess the executive branch's determinations on pain of contempt proceedings. And this is what I think they are doing a very good job there of explaining what everyday Americans are saying, who may not be that involved in anything having to do with the legal system and didn't go to law school, etc. We elected a president, and here is some unelected judge, some district court judge deciding that the executive can't actually do executive things. Is this what John Roberts agreed with We the People?
Well, we don't know. His stay doesn't issue a decision accompanying it. There will be a decision eventually. But John Roberts, who's a very institutionalist sort of person and cares very deeply about the credibility of the judiciary, has to be concerned, as well as other justices, at district courts, not all of whom, but many of whom are run amok here. They are taking on responsibilities to micromanage what amount to policy decisions, and in some cases, political decisions as to how the executive branch is going to run, who you can hire, who you can fire, who you can have audit your books, who you can share records with, and who you can pay and not pay. Federal judges have been running the executive branch or portions of the executive branch, and that's not their role. Yes, of course, they get to rule on the legality of actions by the executive branch. I mean, that's not uncommon. But here, they're making policy decisions. They're micromanaging things. And I think that this is a signal by John Roberts that enough is enough. And we'll see what happens. There are other cases. There's one other case before the Supreme Court on whether they can fire somebody. There are other cases making their way up. But we really have a district court judiciary which has grossly overstepped its boundaries in a separation of powers sense, and have taken on to running and micromanaging the executive branch. And that's not their role. And it may have gotten Democrats some short-term benefit because they've managed to partially freeze aspects of the Trump administration. But I don't think it will hold up, and I don't think it will survive the Supreme Court, and it shouldn't survive the Supreme Court.
Talking to William Jacobson, Cornell law professor, the mind behind legalinsurrection.com. When the court comes back, let's say that we live in a normal world, and we say that the executive can do executive branch things, but the court could also say, okay, it does executive branch things, but it can't necessarily stop spending if Congress appropriated it, right? That seems to be a big sticking point for a lot of people. Would you know off the top of what you've read or what your legal acumen tells you regarding well, not only the separations of power, if Congress is allocating this money, which is their job, right? That power of the purse, can the executive say, hey, you may have allocated it, I just don't want to spend it?
Well, I don't think it's that simple, because Congress allocates money and the executive branch decides who gets that money and how it gets handed out. So perhaps the executive branch can't say we're not going to spend what you've required us to spend, but that doesn't mean we have to send $30 million to this program in Ghana, or we have to spend $40 million on some show in Pakistan, or we have to give some left-wing group connected to various Democrat politicians millions and millions of dollars. So how it gets spent has always been an executive branch function. There's a grant-making process. There is an auditing process. And what the government has said in the case that Justice Roberts just put a stay on is, we're not disputing that if these are lawfully owed bills, we will pay them, but we need an opportunity to review them. The judge can't just say pay, and I think they put a number of 1,000 different contracts. Pay 1,000 contracts, executive branch, and you don't even get to audit them and look at them as to whether you actually owe the money. So that's the issue here. It's not an issue of defying Congress. The executive branch has always decided how the money gets handed out.
Is the Supreme Court, and I would argue that the Supreme Court claims to never want to be political and always gets political. I think John Roberts has done a bad job of splitting the baby here over the years. They want in on this. I mean, it should be them being the ones being in on this, but they're going to want to get in on this and make this declaration as clear as day, unless there's precedent that I don't know about, which is possible, that yes, indeed, the executive could decide that you may have allocated the money, but we're not sending it this way, we're sending it that way. Everybody prepared for this?
Well, I think John Roberts has to get involved, and the Supreme Court has to get involved, because the integrity of the system is at issue. The trust in the courts is already at a historic low. A lot of that is because the Democrats have been demonizing the Supreme Court, but we're at a historic low. And if you get district court judges essentially unlawfully stifling the agenda of the president who just got elected, collapse. There's going to be a complete collapse in trust in the courts. And I don't think John Roberts wants to see that. So John Roberts isn't doing this to say, in my view, John Roberts isn't doing this to save the Trump administration. He's doing it to save the credibility and the support for the judiciary in the country, because he knows that if they go too far, which many district court judges have been going too far, that credibility among the population will completely collapse.
Well, if the Supreme Court says the executive can make these calls, the Democratic Party is going to further collapse. Another conversation for another day. William Jacobson, Cornell law professor at legalinsurrection.com. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. See, Tony, you know how to use the English language. More to get to. I'm Tony Katz, and this is Tony Katz Today.